I'm speaking to you today from Warsaw, Poland. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in Ann Arbor for this important event. But on the other hand, this is a good place to send you a message about authoritarianism. This is a country that's experienced more than its fair share of authoritarianism in the past, and sadly, in the present as well. The building behind me is the Palace of Culture and Science. It was built shortly after World War II out of the rubble that had been Warsaw, directly as a gift from Joseph Stalin. The building was designed, financed, and even constructed by people from the Soviet Union. For some in Warsaw, for many, it came to be seen as a symbol of the new authoritarian regime that had just been imposed upon their country. There was an old joke. Where's the best view in Warsaw? Well, it's from the top of the Palace of Culture. Why is that? Well, because that's the only place in town where you can't see the Palace of Culture.
But in recent years, something unexpected has happened. Nowadays, you'll find miniature versions of the Palace of Culture in all the tourist shops. The building's images can be seen on various PR campaigns for the city. The image is all over the place. Shortly after the fall of communism in 1989, some opposition activists were urging that the building be demolished as a representation of the dark days of the past. Nowadays, such an idea is almost unimaginable. The building is treated as a historical landmark, a source of local pride. Now, this really isn't so much a change of attitude. Instead, it's an assertion of a viewpoint held by many of our Soviets who've always seen the Palace of Culture not as a symbol, but as a building. Whether you think it's an architectural monstrosity or just a bit silly, there's no denying that it is distinctive. And for people of a certain generation, it evokes an era, the 1950s, the 1960s, when they were young, when they were first building their families, building their careers, and literally building their city.
I wanted to begin here, on this spot, with this building in the background, because I think the story of the Palace of Culture offers us an important message about authoritarian regimes. When we think about the contested, deeply problematic, and diverse ways in which people remember this building, we learn something, I think, that's very important about the nature of authoritarianism itself. Something that helps us in understanding the history of authoritarian movements, but also helps us deal with the return of such movements in the present.
As recently as 2014, observers, myself included, thought that Poland had entered a new golden age. The economy was booming, didn't even pause for the Great Recession of 2008. The country had become a major player within the European Union. A centrist, roughly liberal party had governed for 2 long terms, and politics here was becoming wonderfully boring. But this picture was turned upside down by elections in October of 2015, which brought to power a party called Law and Justice, which is known by its Polish initials as PiS. PiS is led by a man named Jarosław Kaczyński, who claims that he believes in democracy. Maybe so, but his definition of democracy and my definition of democracy are very, very different. For Kaczyński, democracy means that people get to elect their leaders. And once elected, the leader is charged with serving as the voice of the nation, the voice of the people. Anyone who then challenges the authority or questions the decisions of the elected leader is in effect challenging the nation itself, challenging democracy. Those who lose elections, in Kaczyński's vision, are supposed to accept their defeat, accept that their views have been repudiated, and then retreat into silence until the next round of elections. There certainly can't be any dissent within the structures of the state in Kaczyński's world. If the courts, if members of other political parties in parliament try to stand in the way of the will of the people, Kaczynski describes this as political chaos or judicial chaos. For him, there are only two alternatives, either obedience or anarchy. This is a system that Kaczynski's friend and ally from Hungary, Viktor Orban, has called illiberal democracy. And it's a system that now rules Poland and Hungary and Russia and Turkey and a growing list of countries. Now, in this sort of system, in this illiberal democracy, real power is with the ruling party, not with the formal institutions of governance. Poland has a president and a prime minister, but they're really not important political figures. They both answer to Kaczynski, and everyone in the country knows where the real power is. Kaczynski himself, meanwhile, does not even hold any important office other than director of his party, president of his party. He's an ordinary member of parliament, but that's all. Peace treats the law, the Polish constitution, as an instrument for manifesting the nation's will, not as a value that should be defended for its own sake. They have no patience for what they call legal technicalities. When the country's constitutional tribunal, which is akin to our Supreme Court, ruled that several of the government's early decrees were unconstitutional, the Prime Minister, on Kaczynski's orders, simply refused to acknowledge those rulings. The court, Kaczynski said at the time, represented the old elites, and their opinions were not relevant. Also typical of today's anti-liberal regimes is their control of the media. The internet and the proliferation of cable TV channels has made the old-fashioned censorship of the 20th century almost impossible, but the anti-liberal regimes of the 21st century have their own way of dealing with this. They have their own media outlets. In the case of Poland, it's Telewizja Polska, the state-owned TV channel. And these outlets sprout propaganda every bit as tendentious and as misleading as the official press organs of authoritarians of the past. Any company that wants government contracts needs to avoid advertising in the independent newspapers or TV stations because that is understood to be an act of opposition. So while that independent media exists, it is struggling financially. The point here is not to silence all independent voices, but to push them into the position of representing the opposition. The media becomes, in a sense, either supportive of the state or the opposition. And this marginalizes the media. It creates a situation in which everyone chooses which media to watch just based on their partisan identity. And people start living in separate worlds. It turns out this is just as effective as the older models of censorship ever were, in fact more so. The old authoritarian regimes, such as the communists here in Poland, tried to control the entire media and thus manipulate the truth. The new authoritarian regimes, such as the current one in Poland, recognize that it's even more effective to transform the truth itself into a partisan preference, with each side having its own. Many of you have probably heard of the phrase Goodwin's Law. It's an axiom coined by a guy named Mike Goodwin way back in the early 1990s, which states that every online argument, if it goes on long enough, will eventually lead to someone comparing someone else to Hitler. If we just add Stalin to that, we have a pretty good description of most Polish internet forums. Now, it's easy, and usually it's justified, to dismiss all these comparisons to Hitler and to Stalin as just so much rhetorical hyperbole. But the real problem here, the problem with crying Nazi or communist, is not necessarily that the comparisons are misguided, although they often are, but the real problem is that not even Nazism and Stalinism, as they actually existed, fit the image that most people have in their minds. Imagine these states as systems of such barbaric and all-encompassing oppression and uniformity and total control that comparing anything in the real world to them becomes absurd. And that blocks us off from a whole range of very important observations about comparisons, similarities, and differences. The truth is that Nazism and Stalinism and post-Stalinist communism were all horrible in 1,000 ways. But they were also a lot more mundane, much less exotic, much less strange than they've usually been depicted. At the heart of the problem is an old term, totalitarianism. When you hear that word, imagine a state in which all freedoms have been quashed, in which total obedience is demanded in all things, in which independent thought itself has ceased to exist. The massive rally of the disciplined crowd becomes a sort of metaphor for this whole totalitarian system. Well, with that image in mind, it really is absurd to compare Kaczynski or Le Pen or Viktor Orban or Erdogan in Turkey or Putin in Russia or Trump in the United States, any of these. It's absurd to compare them to the totalitarians of the mid-20th century. After all, I'm recording this while sitting in Kaczynski's Poland, and I had no concerns earlier going out to take that intro right in the middle of downtown Warsaw. But if we look more closely at the actual authoritarianism of the mid-20th century, maybe the differences aren't as dramatic as we think they are. One of the greatest advances in the study of Polish history in recent years has been a whole wave of scholarship about the Stalinist era, from which all of these pictures come. This new picture of the Stalinist era, this new interpretation of the Stalinist era, gives us a much more nuanced image of that time. And what we've learned is that for most people, that is, for those who were not directly politically engaged and those who were not directly targeted by the regime, the Stalinist era really wasn't a time of terror at all. Most people spent most of their time in those years going to work, going to school, hanging out with their friends in their free time, figuring out how to get ahead in their careers, complaining about their relatives, and enjoying the newest soap opera on the radio. Basically, just living their lives. Now, if you were in a population targeted by the Stalinists, or even more so by the Nazis, life was hell. For the Jews under Nazism, to a somewhat lesser extent for the Slavs under Nazism, for intellectuals, landowners, businessmen, priests under Stalinism, for all those groups, those were very difficult years. But let's put that terror into the perspective of the entire social landscape. Let's do that just by using one example. Here's a statistic that I think will surprise many of you. These are the incarceration rates in Poland before World War II, in Poland in 1950 at the height of the Stalinist era, and in Poland more recently. I've also thrown in the rate for the United States in 1950 to give a point of comparison. So sure enough, the rate increased under Stalinism. And many of those who were in prison at the time were victims of the most obscene injustices. And at that time, the early years of the Cold War, one really could compare communist Eastern Europe and the United States and see a sharp difference. But let's pull back to a more global and more contemporary picture. I think these numbers are, to say the least, evocative and probably startling for many people. Now, I am not suggesting here that the US today is worse than Stalinist Poland. Incarceration rates are certainly not the only way to measure the terror of a police state. They don't capture the whole picture. The fate of those who did get caught up in the Stalinist prison system, not to mention those who got caught up earlier in the Nazi camps, was obviously unimaginably grim and very, very dangerous. Much worse than even the worst US prisons. Much worse. Still, setting all that aside, this chart should give us some pause because it suggests to us the place, the scale, and the context of the system of the police state under the authoritarian regimes of the 20th century. My point is not to whitewash Stalinism or Nazism. Rather, my point is that those 20th century authoritarians were bad in a way that is not quite like the totalitarian regimes of our nightmares. They were bad in a way that is more familiar, far more imaginable for our own societies, far more appropriate for comparisons with our current historical moment. One of the key things that characterizes these authoritarian regimes is not so much universal homogeneity, but loyalty among those who wish to have a public role. Tests of loyalty abound in today's Poland, and this has become one of the defining features of public life nowadays. Perhaps on the most dramatic level, Kaczynski has repeatedly demanded that his followers commit openly unconstitutional acts, such as the example I gave earlier, when the Prime Minister ignored the rulings of the Constitutional Court. This means that if peace ever loses power, the Prime Minister is probably going to be tried for, at the very least, abuse of power. On a more mundane scale, in every branch of the civil service, in all the state-owned businesses, and all the state-owned media, managers have been instructed to fire anyone who isn't loyal to peace. To replace them, party loyalists have been hired, often with little or no qualifications. That means that there are now thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people all across the country whose jobs depend on their ongoing loyalty to peace and, more importantly, on the continued rule of that party. They know that if peace ever loses power and if anything remotely resembling a meritocracy is returned, then they're going to be out of a job. Along with the politics of loyalty, we see the politics of division. Anti-liberal authoritarian regimes don't need to institute any sort of authoritarian system of absolute repression. In fact, here in Poland, in the past few years, protests have been quite common. Whenever anyone accuses Kaczynski of undermining Polish democracy, he just points to these demonstrations and to the many opposition media outlets to prove that democracy is still thriving. Meanwhile, the government tightens its grip on all centers of actual power. They ignore all the norms that used to promote consensus building or respect for diverse views. Most disturbingly, they refuse to even consider that those in the opposition today might someday be in power. When a government begins acting in a way that shows they can't lose power, then that's a very, very worrying sign. The picture I'm painting here is bad. It's very bad. But I want to emphasize once again that while all this is happening, cultural life, social life, all the normal aspects of existence go on as before. I feel a certain disconnect living here, keenly aware that the foundations of liberal democracy are being dismantled on a day-to-day basis. But on a day-to-day basis, everything seems totally normal. And that's not an illusion. Most aspects of life are normal. And that's the point I want to make today. It is possible for most people to live in a society like this without even paying attention to politics. The word most is key here. These regimes thrive on the identification and the persecution of minorities, however those minorities might get defined, ideologically, culturally, racially, nationally, ethnically, whatever. But the flip side of the persecution of minorities is that the majorities get left alone, as long as they show that they understand who's in power.
The system of governance I've been describing is not all that different from the system of government during the mid-20th century's totalitarian, so-called totalitarian regimes, the systems that built structures like this one. Our tendency to imagine authoritarianism as a sort of all-encompassing regime of terror and mind control and uniformity is misleading. And, in fact, I think dangerous. It leads us to a certain complacency that, well, our situation today isn't that bad. It's not nearly that bad. But the point is that even in the worst of the 20th century's authoritarian regimes, most people got along just fine most of the time. It was those who were targeted by the regimes, the minorities, the people who were different, who dissented. They were the ones who were targeted. The complacency of everyone else helped enable that terror.